Okay, so you know how we were talking about legal stuff last time? Well, today we've got some more down-to-earth, practical stuff to really get into.
Definitely practical.
It's all about how legal obligations actually end. Like, how do you know when you're really off the hook, legally speaking?
Right.
And we've got this material from, let me see, Abogados.
Okay.
They're a law firm over in Almeria.
In Spain. Got it.
Yeah, and they lay out these key ways that obligations can be, well, terminated. You know, like how these responsibilities we take on legally can actually be finished. And it's not just, legal mumbo jumbo.
No.
This stuff affects so much. I mean, paying bills, contracts, all sorts of things. So it's really useful for anyone, really.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For sure.
So we're going to kind of break down what these lawyers in Almeria have shared with us, make it nice and clear.
Sounds good.
So let's jump right in. The most common way, I guess, that an obligation is wrapped up is through payment, or as they call it in the source material, pago. Seems simple enough, right? You owe something, you pay it, end of story.
Yeah.
But IMI point out that there are actually 5 really important things that need to happen for that payment to be considered valid legally.
Right.
And for it to actually, for real, like, close the book on what you owed.
Okay. Interesting.
So it's more than just like handing over some cash.
There's more to it, right? More than meets the eye.
Exactly, yeah. The first thing they talk about is identity. And basically what that means is that you have to deliver exactly what was agreed upon.
Oh, okay.
So let's say you were, obligated to provide a certain book, like a very specific first edition kind of thing. Offering a different edition wouldn't cut it, even if it was even rarer or more valuable. It's not what was agreed upon.
I see.
Unless, of course, the other party was cool with the swap. But the point is, you got to be specific in your agreements about what's being exchanged.
Yeah, that's smart. Like, write it down. Be super clear.
Right. It's like, imagine you subscribe to like a specific type of coffee blend.
Yeah.
And the company kept sending you a different variety each month, even if they claimed it was just as good, even better. It's like, that's not what you signed up for.
Yeah, that's frustrating. You want what you ordered.
Exactly. Then there's this concept of integrity. It basically means that the payment needs to be complete.
The whole thing.
The whole thing. Unless you both agreed beforehand to accept partial payments.
Okay.
So think of it like this. Let's say you owe someone money for a service. Like you had your house painted, right? And you agreed on a price.
Okay.
The painter can generally insist on getting the full amount, even if you feel like, oh, they messed up this one little corner.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, you had some agreement about, partial payments for incomplete work.
So it's all about having that agreement up front.
Exactly. Full payment is kind of the expectation, unless you say otherwise.
Makes sense.
And then the third thing they mention is this idea of indivisibility. And it generally means you got to make the payment all at once.
One shot.
One shot. Not in little bits and pieces, unless, again, you both decided on some sort of installment plan from the get-go.
Okay.
It's like, imagine you buy a piece of furniture, and there's a total price. The seller probably won't be thrilled if you suddenly decide, you know what, I'm going to pay you a tiny bit every day, even if it eventually adds up to the full amount. It can get messy.
Yeah, it can.
Then we've got these 2 ideas that sound kind of complex, but they're really not. Capacity of the solvante.
Solvante.
Yeah, and capacity of the acreedor.
Okay.
So solvante is the person paying. Acreedor is the person receiving the payment.
Got it.
And what this basically means is that the right people need to be involved in the payment.
Okay.
So the person making the payment, the solvante, needs to have the legal authority to do that. It's usually the person who owes the money or someone they've given permission to pay on their behalf.
Right.
And on the flip side, the person receiving the payment, the accretor, they need to be legally allowed to receive that money. So it goes to the right person.
Yeah.
You don't want your payment ending up with someone who has no claim on the debt.
No, for sure not.
Okay, so those are the 5 big parts of a valid pago or payment. Now, IMI, they also talk about compensation.
Compensation, yeah.
Okay.
And this sounds like it's maybe a more complicated way for obligations to kind of disappear, where you're not actually making a direct payment.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a little intricate, but it's actually pretty efficient, especially when you have 2 parties who both owe each other money.
Oh, I see.
It's kind of like, if I owe you $100 and you owe me $75,
right,
those debts can kind of cancel each other out.
Ah, okay.
And then I only end up owing you $25.
It's kind of like a balancing act.
Exactly. It's like balancing the books.
I like it. Efficient. And they actually talk about 3 different types of compensation. There's legal, there's conventional, and then there's judicial.
3 different types. Okay.
Yeah. So let's start with legal compensation. It's kind of cool because it basically happens automatically.
It's automatically.
Yeah, like the law just says, hey, these debts, they can offset each other.
Interesting.
But there are a few conditions that have to be met.
Okay.
The first one is that the debts have to be reciprocal. Like, you owe me, I owe you.
Okay, back and forth.
Back and forth. The second is that they need to be what they call liquid, which basically means that they have to be, quantifiable. It has to be a specific amount of money.
Not just a rough guess.
Yeah, no rough guesses.
Got it.
And they also have to be what's called exigible. It's a fancy word for saying that the payment is actually due.
Okay.
So you can't use like a debt that isn't payable yet to offset something. And then, of course, there can't be any law that says, no, you can't do this kind of offsetting.
Makes sense.
So basically, if you have these clear debts to each other and they're due, the law might just automatically consider them partially or fully paid.
So it just happens.
It just happens. I know, it's kind of neat. Do you want like a quick example of how that might play out in real life?
Oh, yeah. An example would be helpful.
Okay, so imagine you've got a small business.
Okay.
And you hire a freelance graphic designer.
Uh-huh.
And they do some work for you, and they send you an invoice for, say, $500.
$500, got it.
And it's due, right. Now, let's say that you had previously lent the same graphic designer $300.
Okay.
And that loan, that repayment is also due.
Right.
In this situation, legal compensation might kick in. That $300 the designer owes you would automatically offset, $300 of what you owe them.
Oh, I get it. So you only end up paying them $200.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Pretty neat, right?
Yeah, very efficient.
So that's how that automatic offset works. Now, the next type of compensation is conventional. And that one basically means, as you might guess, it's based on an agreement between both parties.
Okay, so they decided to do it this way.
Exactly. It happens when they both agree to offset their debts. Even if, all the strict legal requirements for that automatic legal compensation aren't perfectly met.
So maybe it's not 100% clear how much is owed.
Right, exactly. Maybe one of the debts isn't, totally quantified yet.
Yeah.
But both sides are happy to just consider them as balancing each other out. It's about mutual consent, really.
Okay, so it's like a handshake agreement almost.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. They're just saying, you know what, this works for both of us.
Makes sense.
And then the third type is judicial compensation. And I think you can probably guess this one happens as part of a court case.
Oh, so a judge gets involved.
Yeah, a judge gets involved. So it would be like, let's say someone sues you for a debt.
Uh-huh.
And then you countersue, right?
Yeah.
And say, hey, they owe me money too.
Right.
Then the judge can decide, okay, these debts should be compensated.
Okay, so the judge steps in and says, this is how we're going to settle this.
Exactly. So we've covered payment. We've covered this idea of, offsetting debts.
Compensation.
Right, compensation. The third big way that obligations can end, according to these Almeria lawyers, is something called condonation.
The condonation, okay.
And sometimes it's called remission of debt.
Remission, okay.
And this one, I think, is pretty interesting. It's basically like the person you owe money to, they just decide, you know what, I'm not going to collect it.
Really? They just let it go?
They let it go. It's like a gift.
Wow, that's generous.
It is. And they talk about 2 forms of this.
Okay.
There's express condonation.
Express.
And then there's tacit condonation.
Tacit, okay.
So express condonation is pretty straightforward. It's when the creditor clearly says, you know what, I'm forgiving this debt.
They just come out and say it.
They come right out and say it. They can say it in writing. They can say it verbally. But it's clear that they're not going to pursue that debt anymore.
Okay.
Tacit condonation is a little more, I guess, subtle.
How so?
It's when the creditor's actions imply that they're forgiving the debt.
Actions, not words. Got it.
And they actually give a good example of this.
Okay.
It's like, let's say the creditor gives the original loan document back to the person who owes the money.
Oh, like, here you go. You don't owe me anymore.
Exactly. Like, why would you give that back unless you meant it?
Yeah, that sends a pretty clear message.
Right. It's a strong implication. They're basically releasing that person from their responsibility to pay back the debt.
That's fascinating.
And the other thing to remember is that this condonation, this forgiveness, it can be for the whole debt or just a part of it.
Oh, So it can be partial.
Yeah, it can be partial. So the creditor might just give up their right to claim a portion of what's owed, not the whole thing.
Interesting. So there's flexibility there.
Yeah, there is. And just like with payment, there are certain conditions for this condemnation to be valid.
Okay, what kind of conditions?
Well, one of them is something called legal capacity. It applies to both the person forgiving the debt and the person whose debt is being forgiven.
So both sides have to be legally capable.
Yeah, the creditor needs to be legally able to make a gift, essentially, or to waive their right to collect. And the debtor needs to be capable of accepting that gift.
Right.
And then, of course, this whole act of forgiveness can't break any existing laws.
Makes sense.
So, like, for example, if someone's facing bankruptcy, they can't just forgive a debt that's owed to them if it's going to mess things up for their other creditors.
Oh, so you can't use it to get out of your own responsibility.
Right, exactly. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Got it.
Now, these lawyers from Almeria, they also mentioned just briefly a few other ways that legal obligations can end.
Other ways.
Yeah, other ways. And I'm not going to go into huge detail, but I'll give you a quick rundown.
Okay.
So there's something called novation. Novation. And it's basically when an old obligation is replaced with a brand new one.
They swap it out.
They swap it out, but both sides have to agree to it. It's like refinancing a loan. The old loan is paid off with a new one, maybe with different terms.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And then there's something called, and this one always makes me smile a little bit, it's called confusion.
Confusion. That does sound a little funny.
Yeah, confusion.
Yeah.
And it's basically when, like, the roles of the debtor and the creditor, they merge. They become the same person.
Oh, that is confusing.
Right. Like, imagine if your company owed money to another company, and then those two companies merged.
Okay.
Well, the obligation would just disappear because you can't owe money to yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Then there's Impossibilidad Sobrevenida, which is a mouthful, but it's basically when something happens that makes it impossible to fulfill the obligation.
Like what?
Like, let's say there was a natural disaster that destroyed some goods that were supposed to be delivered.
Okay, something outside of your control.
Exactly. And it has to be something outside the debtor's control.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's this idea of prescription.
Prescription, okay.
It's basically like a legal time limit on debts.
A time limit.
Yeah. So after a certain period of time, which is defined by law, if the creditor doesn't try to collect the debt, it just expires.
Huh, interesting.
So as you can see, there are quite a few different ways that these legal commitments can come to an end.
It's not always cut and dry.
It's not. And it's interesting to think about, payment with all its specific rules. This whole balancing act of compensation, the act of forgiving a debt, all these different things. It shows that these obligations aren't necessarily set in stone forever.
Right. Things can change.
Exactly.
And knowing all of this, I mean, it's really valuable in a lot of areas of life. Whether you're running a business, managing your own money, or even just making agreements with people, it can be really empowering.
It is, because you know where you stand.
Exactly.
And it can help you make smarter decisions about how you handle debts.
For sure.
Both the debts you owe and the debts that are owed to you. You can even see potential solutions in situations that might seem complicated at first.
Yeah, it helps you see the bigger picture.
Right, and you can make sure you're operating within the legal framework.
That's crucial.
It is. So let's just quickly go over what we talked about.
A recap.
A recap.
Okay.
Drawing from those lawyers in Almeria, imi. We looked at payment, right, with all its important requirements.
Yes.
We talked about compensation, which can be legal, agreed upon, or ordered by a court.
Right.
And then that interesting idea of letting go of a debt through condonation. Forgiveness, exactly. Which can be done explicitly or through actions. And then we got that brief glimpse into other ways obligations can end. Novation, confusion, impossibility, and prescription.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's good information to have.
It is good information to have. So this has been a really, really interesting deep dive.
Yeah, I've learned a lot.
Me too.
No.
And thinking about all these different ways that obligations can be resolved, I'm kind of curious, is there a debt that you're familiar with, maybe even your own, where you could see one of these, maybe an unexpected way of it being settled?
Oh, that's a good question.
I know it's something to think about.
It is.
Like going beyond the standard, here's your money, thanks for the service.
Yeah.
Like what other possibilities might exist out there?
Yeah, that's something I'm going to have to ponder.
Yeah, me too.
Food for thought.
Definitely food for thought.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.